data use cases in the digital humanities. I'm going to pass the microphone down and ask my colleagues to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Natalie.
Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Rothman. I'm a historian and an anthropologist by training, and I'm a co-conspirator with Krista on the Dragoman Renaissance project that you'll be hearing about momentarily. And in my spare time, I also chair the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies up the street here.
I am Susan Brown. I'm from the University of Guelph, where I hold a Humanities Chair in Collaborative Digital Scholarship. I am a literary historian by training. I'm in the School of English and Theater Studies there, and also teach in our Culture and Technology Studies program.
Hello everyone, I'm Michaela Lavan. I am the course director. I am a librarian by training and a DH Wrangler by vocation.
Yes, and she said I lead the links and the core projects, the LEAP project, which you'll be hearing about in a little bit.
Thank you. So the question we had asked ourselves here is we're trying to figure out how well do we feel Islandora handles the use case of the digital humanities, and specifically the linked data cases of large and complex DH projects. So the two projects there'll be 4 projects you'll hear about today, but the one here is the Dragoman Renaissance Research Project, which we would like to start off with. So we'll be giving you a sense of the questions the project seeks to answer, and then some of the things that we've been doing to support that in Islandora, specifically on the RDF side. The questions we had for presenters were, what is the subject matter, and what are the research questions your project seeks to answer? What are the data models and ontologies you're working with, and how are you mapping them to Islandora entities and content types? What goals do you have generally for the functionality of your research application, and the challenges that you're working through when it comes to linked data? So we'll start off with the Dragoman Renaissance Research Project, which has been, I think that we've been working together for 10 years by this December on this project. So we're actually on there is an active Islandora legacy site. We've moved and migrated a lot of the data, and we're actually on our 2nd beta. So we had a beta of this that we presented on in Islandora Claw, and now we are working on another beta, which is in more the modern Islandora. And I'm just acknowledging our funders here on the bottom, the Jackman Humanities Institute and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So I'm going to pass it to Natalie, who will tell you more about what the project is about.
Thanks, Krista, and I'll try and stay as much as possible at the meta level, recognizing that this might be at a more relevant level for participants here in terms of what the project is about, and just to communicate some of the complexity of the data that the project is dealing with. So very generally, what are dragomans? Dragomans were diplomatic interpreter translators. They worked in Istanbul and in other port cities and capitals throughout the Mediterranean and Europe from roughly the 16th to the 18th centuries. And we were really critical in mediating diplomatic and more broadly cultural and political relationships between the Ottoman Empire and other polities at the time. I won't tell you too much about the research that feeds into this project. You can read about it in a monograph that I published in 2021 that's available in open access called The Dragoman Renaissance, and also read about it more on our website. Mentioning the monograph, I think, is relevant here because, in a way, only a fraction of the data that I had collected over 20 years at this point made it into the monograph, in part because of the nature of monographic writing, and in part because a lot of the data actually has to do with forms of analysis that don't easily lend themselves to the long-form narrative styles of monographic writing in the humanities, but present, I think, really exciting opportunities for humanists to think about what they do with this data, and kind of at that level, that's more or less what we're trying to do with this project, which is to think about how does one take collections of materials gathered over more than a dozen archives and an equal number of libraries all across what today are Turkey, the Balkans, and Europe, in 6 or more languages, visual as well as textual material, personal archives, state archives, published early books, and a lot of other types of materials, and bring them together in one platform that allows one to think systematically about the relationships between these different types of materials, and glean new analytical insights from them. So what are some of the analytical issues that we're talking about here when we think about gathering these disparate materials and turning them into structured data sets? Well, at a very general level, what interested me and what I think continues to animate the project is this question of how does one think, on the one hand, about the sociological dimensions of the individuals who the project studies. So the places of provenance, their educational backgrounds, their kinship structures, the kinds of institutions that they inhabited, the kinds of business enterprises that they were involved in, as shaping the kinds of semiotic activities that are represented in the archives that they created. So how does one draw connections between the aggregate of information about the individuals and the kinds of textual practices and visual practices that they engaged in? And in a way, how does one begin to both identify ontologies that are granular enough to address these complex questions and that allow for flexibility over time in recognizing that the nature of the structure of the data itself is not fixed, but lends itself to reiteration as the project grows, as more questions emerge, as new facets of the data are revealed through this process of structuring and restructuring. So that's, in a way, what we've been trying to do with the project, I think with varying degrees of success, but I think the exercise itself has already revealed a lot of opportunities in thinking through these questions and the connections between the sociological and the semiotic, the structured and that which is not fully captured by standardized schemas of data. And maybe I'll stop here and allow Kirsta to elaborate.
Thank you, Natalie. So there's a couple of data models I wanted to show you. So these have been iterative, as Natalie alludes to, when we try and figure out what are our objects, what are our taxonomies, what are our relationships. And so what you see here is the latest version where we have these sort of first form objects, which are people and documents and archival objects, as well as the pages or pieces that make up the archival objects, which vary widely in format, I would say. I'm looking at Natalie to make sure I get that right. Because the organization, the archival practices are also something of interest to the study. So being able to track relevant information about how those objects are structured is also important. And you can see everything in blue here is a controlled vocabulary, and then we have kind of crow's foot notation denoting what sorts of relationships we expect to find in between the data. If you zoom in on just one term in one of these taxonomies, you reveal another layer. So the more that Natalie queries and considers this data, what emerges is a further network on each individual taxonomy term, relating it to all of the other terms in all of the other languages that are represented in this data set. So this is a single term that has been diagrammed by Natalie to show you the various interrelationships between separate terms in the taxonomy. And I understand this taxonomy to be something that is, Natalie's always been very committed to openness. You don't meet many humanities professors who do the kind of work that Natalie did to publish her monograph as open access. So this vocabulary is conceptualized as being of potential use to other scholars who are working in this region, because the work that Natalie's doing, it's work that everyone has to do. Everyone's trying to unpack the relationship between these vocabularies in different languages. So when it comes to the interface of modern Islandora, I just wanted to show you some screenshots from the latest hot off the presses prototype. And every time we take all of the data out of the spreadsheets and put it all back into Islandora and we start querying it, that's when we start seeing what's wrong, what needs to be repaired, what we need to do, and then essentially we can pull it all back out and manipulate it and put it all back in again. And the good news there is that I think, Bennett, how long did it take you to map and ingest the data? It took him a week and a half. Now, he's a genius, don't get me wrong, but it was much harder in the old system to be able to do that. And now, rather than having to pull everything out in some sort of giant solar query, it's going to be much more possible to find areas of the data that need amendment, pull out subsections of them and repair them and put them back in. And I think that the entire workflow is going to speed up quite a lot with modern Islandora. So what you see here, unfortunately depicting 3 missing pages, which a committed graduate student is photographing, I think, in an archive, maybe as we speak. It's really very interesting where these images come from. These are archival objects, so if you think back on that diagram I showed you, this is the view that you see. It's a fairly standard looking Islandora advanced search. You've got your custom facets on the side, and then we have each of the archival objects. And then for the documents, it's the same thing. We have sort of a browse page. We have a different set of facets for you to browse the documents. And the same with the people. We have all of these little, they look like, I realized after we ingested it how much they look like the little washroom man. So we will be updating that. But we can do that easily in modern Islandora. So you can see that these are the browse views with custom facets, all off-the-shelf features that we're just doing this through configuration. So this is something, in the 10 years from this project, we've gone from needing a lot of custom code to really just needing to do a lot of fairly heavy configuration, but still, configuration over code for me every single time. These are the individual interface object views that we're able to facilitate. So here on the one side, you'll see the Mirador viewer, which we've seen a lot of in this in this conference, as well as the pages and the metadata that make that up. And then underneath, you can see that Natalie has made the linkages between the documents and the archival pages, which are part of the archival object, so we can bring all that in a view and show you what documents are that are related to this archival object, if that's what you're interested in. On the other side, you can see the view we have for a person. So this person doesn't have a lot of metadata. Angela Tarsia, I'm probably pronouncing that not the way that person would have, has a little bit of metadata, but any metadata that we have for the person will be there, and you see a table underneath. Those are all the events, if you were to go back to the diagram. These are all the events that happen to the person, sorted by date, and then we have all the people that are related to that person, and then we have all the documents. If you go to the document level, this is just to zoom in, that we have the linkages in the data between the document, which is sort of the transcribed content of a document, and the pages that it relates to. So here you can see we've got a linkage between the document, and there are 2 pages to the right. We do have a prototype viewer that will allow you to see those pages alongside the transcript. We just didn't get it in time for the conference, so that's one of the next things that we have to review. But the intention is that a researcher will be able to look at the metadata and the transcript for the document and at the document pages in the same interface. Just another little point about searching. What we've done here is just created some default fields for the advanced searching. So advanced search supports both fuzzy searching and bounded searching and Boolean searching. And these are some of the pieces that we have indexed. But again, because of the way that modern Islandora works, when Natalie says, I really think we need to index this characteristic of the events, it's going to be like a 4-click operation in order to do that, and waiting for the progress bar, and then Natalie will be able to go in and make new queries, and I think that's exciting. And the same thing with the facets on the side. And so you can see these are not your standard library facets. These are not genres that we're familiar with in the library world, but it's very simple. We can still use the same infrastructure to present them. This is a little bit hard to read, but I wanted to show you how we're taking that data model that's been produced and we're mapping it directly into Drupal. So if you can see here, we're reusing the repository content type for both documents and archival objects, and we've created 3 new content types. So that's the event class, the time-bound entity, and the relationship content type. We've also substantially expanded the fields that exist in the person taxonomy. And what we're doing here, and this is where I'm gonna look again at my colleague Nat to make sure I say this the right way. We're modifying our linked data approach because the last time, this idea, so we have a number of relationships and the relationships have a lot of characteristics. So in linked data, normally you say so-and-so is author of something else, but we need to describe things in a lot more richly, far more richly than can be expressed with a sort of a standard bibliographic statement. So in order to do that, we're creating these intermediate objects, these relationships, so that the relationships can express all the complexity of the relationships between people and documents, And we can continue to append properties, and the benefit of that boxed approach to reification is that we can be very much stricter and much more defined in the fields that we say belong to the relationship between a person to a person. So we can control that a lot more firmly, and we're going to wait and see what challenges might come for us in querying, but a big benefit is that it is not custom programming. So these, for example, this is just a screenshot of, just to show you the way that this mapping works if you're doing it through YAML files in Islandora. These are all of our old mapping fields, and we'll be updating it. But in the old system, we programmed indexing supporting n-array relationships, the n-array data structure, and that required custom programming. We are not going to need to do custom programming to support this data model in linked data because we've chosen this boxed approach to reification. So there is a way of doing this in quads, and there are more complex ways of doing this, but we really feel like this is going to give us the most flexibility and give us the least amount to maintain as the project continues to evolve its research questions. So we're mapping the data to existing ontologies. We're customizing only when we need to. And that, I think, is about it. I don't know, Nat, did you want to say anything else about RDF star? Okay. All right, we'll leave it there then, and I'll pass the microphone to our colleagues on the other table.
I just wanted to first thank the first speakers for a very nice and tight demonstration of how Islandora can support the very linked open data approach to research. We're going to speak here about the linked open data workflows that we are developing, particularly bridging the LEAF platform that I mentioned briefly on Tuesday during the short talks, and the linked toolkit that Susan is going to speak more about. So LEAF stands for a linked editing academic framework. It's the code base for the next iteration of the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory, which we pronounce QUIRC. LEAF is built on Islandora 2 and is a multi-institutional and international collaborative endeavor amongst the group of digital humanities scholars. As a virtual research environment, it brings a suite of functionalities that enable collaborative work, such as group functionality to support research projects with multiple user roles, pedagogical projects, individual workspaces. We're enabling user dashboards and customized workflow management, including object locking for editing purposes, as well as XML editing and publishing via integrated web applications developed in-house or by the wider Canadian DH community. QUIRC is actually the most mature of the 3 instances of LEAF we have so far, has been fully operational since 2016 as an Islandora 7 site. It hosts over 30 research projects varying in subject matter from journalism to theater studies to literary history. We hold currently over 400,000 objects with a concentration of things to do with the Canadian culture and women's writing. On average, we have about 100 active authenticated users, so people who contribute materials to QUIRC every year, and about 10,000 unique visitors every year as well, which we were told we are the second site supported by Compute Canada in terms of traffic after another large DH project. QUIRC was always built with the intention of mobilizing the research data as linked open data, but never quite managed to go beyond being LOD ready. It requires a larger ecosystem to become truly usable as linked open data per se.
So because we're hosting such a wide range of projects, different disciplines, different domains, and so on, there's no single set of research questions, unlike the Dragonlance project, which has this wonderfully focused set of questions. But projects that understand the linked data side of things are really interested in bringing together related data to better understand and contextualize content. For instance, we have a number of projects on women's writing, and so they're referring to the same people, but how can we bring that data together and use it to contextualize what appears in any single data set, so that we have a basis for inquiry across the data sets into culture and writing, especially in Canada. So it's about exposure and reusing the data. It's also an experiment in critical infrastructure studies, basically about how we make linked open data, which is very technologically complex, accessible to researchers who might not consider themselves to be digital humanists, but are interested in making their data accessible and useful by others. I myself have been working since the 1990s on a project in women's writing, which has been sort of our test case for a lot of this work, and for that we've developed much more specific competency questions, which actually overlap quite a lot with Dragonlance questions. They're basically prosopographical questions about how people are related to the context in which they operate and the institutions with which they interact, and the events that they participate in, and so on. And so we initially, when we started working with linked data for Orlando, developed a set of competency questions associated with a bespoke ontology that we produced. This is not, however, what LINCS is using, as you'll learn. So, for me, as somebody who works in critical infrastructure studies, the biggest question is really, how can we make linked data work for humanities researchers? How can we really use the cultural data that many of us are creating that provides rich context for the artifacts that are found in institutional repositories, in memory institutions, and so on? We have the deep knowledge that brings that stuff alive. We have the current knowledge that contextualizes it in respectful and sensitive ways. These two universes, although we're all making data, they don't tend to connect, right? So how can we do that in ways that will encourage researchers to produce data in this form and encourage institutions to bring that data into their views of their objects? So that's why we applied for and we're fortunate enough to get funding for the linked infrastructure for networked cultural scholarship, which is a cyber infrastructure project funded by CFI, which is really about, the program was about mobilizing existing data sets. And so in this case, what we said is we want to take a bunch of data sets about culture from a range of researchers and disciplines and transform it into linked open data in order to be able to evaluate its utility and make it more useful to others. So LINCS sees itself very much as part of a larger ecosystem for cultural linked data, and it's really about trying to interweave that data that's published by institutions with researcher data in order to transform how we can interact with the human cultural record online by means of linked data technologies. So LINCS, in a nutshell, is really an environment for creating and publishing linked open data, and LEAF is part of that system. It's meant to be the accessible onboarding piece for people who are really much more comfortable working with TBI or creating metadata around objects that they want to upload or whatever. And so the simplified diagram shows that basically we're talking about source data sets that then get converted with a range of different techniques and different amounts of resources associated with them depending on the data set and the researchers involved and the resources available. It gets ingested into LINCS in ways that link it up with other external linked data sets. And then this was not an emphasis of the project per se, but the next stage will be building out the access points in a range of ways. But we have a number of access points that will make it available initially and make it available also for continued refinement and augmentation. Under the hood, it's a lot more complicated. Happy to talk about this at the break or whatever, but there's a lot going on. And that's really, that was the rationale for links in many ways, is that the linked data stack is so complicated that to produce something, that for anybody to be able to really work with it, we needed an infrastructure that would support a range of projects.
Thank you. So this complicated diagram here becomes even more complicated when we look at the way we envision the interaction between links and leaf. We envision this interaction happening at different moments and at different stages in the editorial processes that leaf supports. For example, entity lookups will be managed and aggregated to different authority files via service provided by links, or entity annotations within LeafWriter that can be partially automated by NER and linking, also supported by tools developed by links. So for the purpose of this presentation, I am going to focus on this stage, and that is how can we push the linked open data that is produced within Leaf into the larger linked open dataverse. And we are doing this via what we call the Leaf Links Bridge. So because we're working with two different sets of technologies and relatively different philosophies between the virtual research environment and the links toolkit, we had to establish from the beginning a number of guiding principles that have their own implications. For the purpose of clarity and avoiding duplication, ambiguity, etc., we are considering the Leaf source materials as the source of truth. That means that linked open data that is coming from Leaf cannot be manually edited in the link-supported research space. Leaf is also Leaf source materials are also changing over time as people continue to edit and enhance their materials. So that raised some questions, and we had to make provisions for updating, adding, and deleting graphs within the links Drupal store. Also, there is the fact that to produce linked open data grade materials, you have to be very, very careful and consistent in your metadata, and it adds a lot to the workload of some of these research projects. So we made it optional so that a project could be hosted by Leaf and take advantage of the Leaf functionality without being forced into publishing as linked open data. Data modeling is one of the ways in which we try to make it possible for all these projects, these different projects with different research questions and potentially differences in how they model their data, work together and work with the bridge. We're using standard Elandora content types, and we are using common linked open data mappings for Leaf and other links projects or research groups. For example, the TI document conversion tools that were developed somewhere else in Leaf, in links, we're using them in Leaf as well. We're also reusing established authorities and vocabularies wherever possible, such as VIF, Getty, Geonames, Wikidata. We're minting URIs in links for entities only when they are needed. And we are creating SCOS vocabularies, again, as needed, which are hosted in a links Cosmos instance. Links has adopted SciDoc CRM for modeling. A lot of scripting here, which was to be expected. It's a very complex map, and that is partially because SciDoc CRM is quite complex. I don't think I understand it fully yet, and probably Susan will say that she doesn't either. It's an event-oriented ontology, and it makes things a bit more complicated for us because, as you can see from here, what we have here on the left side of the slide is the native linked open data, Anadora linked open data for a title property, and here is how that is modeled in SciDoc CRM as an event-focused ontology. So it didn't quite work for us to just modify the RTF mappings in Islandora. We had to come up with a different approach to conversion. We also had to determine exactly what we are converting, what we are turning into linked open data that's available via links. So we're doing this for the leaf native metadata via automated conversion using XML mappings to Ferberu, which is a SciDoc CRM extension for bibliographic information. We are pushing to links the web annotations created using LeafWriter. They don't need, thankfully, they don't need any conversions because they are already links compatible. And we are also supporting a number of custom linked open data extractions from projects like the Orlando project, for which we have already established linked open data extraction scripts. As I mentioned earlier, we considered it quite important that not all projects supported by LEAF will have to necessarily push their data as linked open data. So those projects that choose not to or are deemed not quite ready to do this could still benefit from the linked data functionality that is built in to LEAF already. And there will be a number of curated and vetted projects that will be able to publish their data via links as linked open data. We thought it's quite important to give a lot of control to those researcher groups as to when they are considering their work ready to be pushed. So we're enabling a manual workflow as well as an automated one. And this is kind of difficult because I wanted to make a visual representation of these next two slides with the hope that it would make it clearer how we're doing it. The steps are quite straightforward, I would say, even if there are a lot of them. We're enabling a new property on the group, on the Drupal group, called LOD enabled. It's also we're also making it available on the repository item, on a custom repository item field, because we think that there would be projects group administration views to allow group owners, project PIs, for example, to decide when to manually push their linked open data. And we're building in the backend of Drupal a functionality that would listen for any object or group change and then send an API call to the links conversion endpoint, where that call would also contain the file, the JSON file, which will contain the out-of-the-box Islandora linked open data, along with the XML file for the XML document object. The links conversion endpoint would apply the scripts according to the metadata of the object it receives, cache that within a link's S3 storage, and then periodically have that Drupal API calls enabled from the interface sent to the links conversion endpoint to update the graph belonging to that specific research project within the links dataverse. I'm not sure how much, people would be interested in in our side of how things are handled on the link side. We're basically managing two graphs for each project. One that contains everything within Drupal for that project, whether it's published in Drupal or whether it's in draft stage. And one that is basically considered ready for publication and published within Drupal. That graph for those projects that have LOD enabled as a property, they can manually check their linked open data in the linked research space and from there publish it as real linked open data.
Okay, so we're moving along here, and we're happy to talk about where we are in the progress and where we are in terms of progress. But really, just to try and wrap things up quickly, this is very much about, in my view, making cultural data that's useful for the humanities, making fair data, like putting cultural data in a repository somewhere where somebody can download it as a file is not fair in terms of what fair data is meant to do. And I think linked data really does provide us with the tools for doing that. It's complicated, it's complex, but it does mean that we can create data that is on the one hand very nuanced, quite granular, but also situated and contextualized, and that matters a lot. As I said before, a lot of the researchers are not necessarily in it for the heavy-duty technological work and the sort of semantic web piece of it, but what they can see, I think, is the value of sharing their data, and what they will get from links immediately is the ability to push their data out as linked data and expose it in different ways. So allowing it to travel across the web. We have a context plugin, as we call it, that essentially scans any web page that you're on as long as the text isn't in the DOM, as long as maybe it's using Mirador in the new way that Islandora will be using it. As long as it can read the text, it will look for entities that links knows something about, and then it will provide data from the links triple store right on the web page that you're at. So it doesn't take people away from an institutional website, for instance. It keeps them in context and provides additional information coming from trusted research data sources. So we hope that that will entice people to really experiment with using linked data, which is really the purpose of the links infrastructure, is to give us the tools to really evaluate how well it can work for us and what we need it to be able to do. This, of course, comes with a lot of challenges, which we're happy to talk about. The major one is really the tension between the generalized data models and ontologies on the one hand, and the specifics that researchers need in order to get that nuance. And that I'm looking forward to a conversation about taxonomies, because that really puts a lot of pressure on the vocabularies to do the kind of work that linked data needs to be able to do. So we're trying to hit the right balance there. We do believe that LEAF is a virtual research environment. The data is supposed to change, it's supposed to be dynamic, so that does create complexity in terms of trying to create persistent linked data. And it definitely makes it more complex, as you can see from the system diagrams, to think of this and to do it as a kind of ecology of modular, independent but interlinked tools, as opposed to sort of trying to do it all within Islandora. So looking forward to the conversation, and thank you so much.
I think we can open up the questions, right? Anybody have any questions for us? Please, Mark, go ahead.
I guess I may have missed something, but you spoke of maintaining the graph. My understanding of linked data graphs is that they're by nature dynamic, and they connect dots in real time based on the user's interests. Can you explain what you meant by maintaining the graph?
Sure. So I think. Right, yes. So the question about what do we mean by maintaining the graph, since linked data is sort of all about like real-time delivery of information, etc. I think this goes, to scholarly needs around citationality and reproducibility of results. So you need to be able to use, in some sense, you need to let the graph grow and update, but you also have to be able to point to, the evidence that you are drawing on in a scholarly sense. So there's that tension between needing to essentially snapshot the data from time to time and archive it so that it can be pointed to or reused when necessary in order to test the scholarship that's based on it, but also letting it grow.
So do you cache or say archive a graph that the user generates, or do you pre-generate that?
So the question is, do we cache or archive a graph that the user generates, or do we pre-generate them? We're thinking of them from the production standpoint initially, but there's a lot to be worked through in terms of how we let people build on those graphs. So, one of the environments that we're working with is the research space environment, where users would be able to generate their own knowledge graph, and then essentially they're pulling in the pieces that they want from that other graph and creating their own, and that those are named graphs that can also be archived.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the room or comments?
If not, I have a question for you
Yes,
both,
thank you.
which has to do with your taxonomy. So you gestured at the fact that yes, I was really impressed and also kind of heartened by the complexity of your sort of taxonomy model and the degree of sort of detail and nuance in it. And Krista, when you were talking about it, you talked about the value of it to other researchers. So can you talk about how that work becomes available through your, is it available, I guess, in what different ways is it available to researchers beyond sort of being able to read the application of it within your data on the screen within your site?
Aspirational.
Yeah, it really is aspirational at this point, but I will say that what we presented is actually significantly simplified compared to the actual thinking. I didn't even get into the whole question of translation practices and the nuanced understanding that we're trying to build there, and the fact that it is a multilingual corpus. So the question of translation is both an analytical question and a very practical question in terms of how we think about the relationship between objects that are commensurate in some contexts but not in others, and over time, and depending on the perspective of the individual engaging with them. So it gets quite complex. I think the idea is that we will expose these taxonomies so that they can be reiterated and modified for other uses as well. That's kind of in the grand scheme of things. So of course there are all kinds of questions as to the workflows for integrating input from the community, right? And how much you want to constantly reiterate these. But the project itself, I mean, Kirsta made it sound like it's all me, but there's actually a whole group of scholars that are involved in this and conversations and have really benefited from the multiple perspectives of people who are grounded either in Ottoman studies, in history, in archival studies, in data science. So in a way, this kind of also goes into how these ontologies are being developed in real time as a collaborative effort from the get-go.
The challenge, one of the challenges I see on the horizon, I'd be interested in your perspective, because I think you're doing the same thing, is in that your URI production, you know, and being able to dereference those URIs reliably over time. So we've talked on our team, and we're like, well, are we going to make arcs for all these people? Are we going to go into linked data, and then are we going to go to Wikidata and make all kinds of people entities, and then add our repository data as references for them so that Wikidata won't take them away for not being notable enough? Like, we're trying to figure out what are the ways that we can distribute that, because it is quite unique, you know, a lot of these people, and some of the people are, you know, as you saw, we had that one on the screen, there's not a lot of metadata for that person, which makes it harder to argue for URIs that are hosted elsewhere. Not to say that we're fairly confident that we can continue to resolve those URIs over time, but it is a challenge, I think. There's so many little bits and pieces. And the thing that we haven't gotten into yet in Islandora is that reflecting that complexity in the data. So that's something that, you know, Natalie, for that one term, I know you created that diagram for the research note. And so you had looked at the data and worked with the rest of the research team to diagram that complexity, but ultimately we'll want to reflect that and index it and have it in the system, and we haven't done that yet. So it's going to be a lot of interlinking, basically between taxonomy fields, which is not something usually Drupal taxonomies historically were mostly focused on hierarchies. And this is absolutely supposed to be not about hierarchies at all. So right now, a lot of the vocabularies are multi-fielded, and we're managing that just through entities, but I imagine we're going to have entity references between our taxonomies in order to really express the richness of the data over time. And then you're right, there is the whole issue of how we're going to make those graphs available to others, I guess.
And that's before we even get to the challenge of temporality, because part of the complexity that is not reflected in these diagrams is that any relationship that we're claiming between entities is time-bound and place-bound and language-bound, and as soon as you move beyond that frame, you've now...
And a certain level of certainty.
Yes.
And that's why we're going to the boxes. Because we need the box. Sorry, go ahead,
We get to that question. How, sort of in serializing your triples, how do you sort of qualify them? Or are you qualifying them?
The risk provenance data that is included, each of the graphs itself contains metadata about the research project that originated that graph. Each assertion, for example, in the web annotation model, if you are familiar with it, it contains information about who made that annotation, about the string of text that was annotated, where it came from, and so on. So we're kind of keeping accountability around the linked open data as much as possible with the linked open data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole question of like a triple, I always feel like a fraud when I'm introducing people to linked open data. So it's really simple. It's a subject and there's a predicate and there's an object. If you want to really say anything that's useful for research, you move away from, a triple is useless, right? Yeah, as Manila says, some of it's covered. We don't reify. As I see it, C.CRM sort of just took a different route from reification. You sort of hang everything on events, and then you can situate them in all sorts of ways. Same with the web annotation data model. It's sort of like it's a solution to the problem of reification. So I think that would be an interesting conversation to have. But yeah, it's really hard. I think we don't have a standardized way of really doing provenance. There was a great paper at the DH 2023 conference that was out a couple weeks ago on just like everything all the way up to RDF star and so on. And there's no single accepted way of doing it. So I think it's going to take a while for us to to work it out, and Wikidata does it, but that's because they're not really doing linked data under the hood. So it's hard, I think, to create these standardized structures. Well, yeah, I mean, there's provenance, as you said, at the data set, like at the graph, at the level of the graph, and then you're using quads, or there's provenance at the level of the statement, and I think we need both. And there's not really, there's not really accepted solutions, I think, in either area yet. So it'll take a while. And then I think, I agree with you that the question of PIDs and how we get really persistent identifiers and get them usable over time is a huge one. And I don't think it can be solved by research projects. Actually, we need real infrastructure for that. And maybe it's the library community. I think that's sort of our best hope so far. But I would really think Canada needs to figure out how to do this. Because we're so far behind what a lot of other countries are doing, particularly in Europe, in terms of, creating these large sets of identifiers, and the people we will mint for will be the people that we don't know anything about, right? So how do we do it in a way that makes it possible to find those people and link up, their occurrences when there, is so little information about them in ways that will, build out the graph in a meaningful way over time.
I mean, it's so funny. I think it's so interesting what you're saying about the national infrastructure, because I always have that same feeling. I go to an international conference and I'm like, but I'm seeing these gestures. You look at the Alliance and some of these, they're working on sort of national infrastructures, even the expansion of Dataverse, Borealis is it's in the right direction, but of course they always think of the humanists last, it feels like. It feels like they think of the cultural data and the library as well, kind of later on. It all seems to be very driven by scientific research data.
Yeah, and by research data management and research offices. That's
Yes.
It's not historical.
Yeah, they're not facilitating the research methodology that really you want.
Publications so that they can measure our productivity.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But I think I see slow movements in that way, and sometimes people really resist them, but I think the better a national supporting infrastructure we get, the better off we'll be. And I think the libraries want to do a lot more to help and support, and it's just the same resource crunch that's experienced everywhere.
And I think the libraries get it in the abstract. I think that what researchers need is to see the value in relation to their work. Like, they need to see some compelling applications of linked data where they say, aha, this happened because the data was linked. There was a moment of insight, there was a moment of serendipity, new knowledge got created, something got discovered. And that, because it is heavy lifting to get it all going, it's going to take a little while before we get there. But I think it's really worthwhile work. And I'm really glad that Islandora is sort of, at its base, leveraging these technologies. So I guess I'm interested in insights from the people who are more technologically savvy about how all that works, the ways that we could serve these sorts of use cases, because I think it will pay off in the long run.
Thoughts in the room about complex linked data in Islandora? Yes.
I mean, one of the big challenges you get with this is, this becomes less of a technology problem and more of a human bandwidth problem of how do you get the people to generate the metadata and in a structure that you can bulk load, or at least be able to generate in bulk. We were just having earlier today a discussion about, a lot of what we do is create CSV documents that are then uploaded, but there's only so much complexity you can get in a CSV, but then you have to start training people on, various other formats, be it JSON or TEI. I remember going to Digital Humanities in like 2010, when everyone was talking about TEI, but again, the problem everyone was highlighting is, how are we going to train all these people to use TEI to be able to get the throughput that we need to do this at scale? So I don't really know that it's really a technical challenge. We can model this and we can throw out your serializations, not throw out, but produce these serializations. But it's the human effort of gathering it and creating it and loading it is really what becomes the primary challenge.
Yes, which is why Leaf, right? I mean, Leaf is, what we're trying to do is take the metadata work, like somebody wants to upload their collection of photographs, or somebody wants to upload their handwritten stuff and take it from Transcribus and then put it into Leaf, you know, to create a collection of materials and then be able to comment on them and so on. Like, that's work that they see an immediate value to because they're pushing their work out. And then it is generic, it is, you know, only a first step, but being able to generate linked open data from that as just a byproduct of what they're doing and then show some value from that, I think is, you know, one way to go. There'll be a few people, there'll be a small segment of people who just like get, you know, we have our CDOC geeks in the links community, but they're going to be few and far between. Really, we want to show people, okay, like if you take the time to use, you know, instead of putting up a WordPress site, use Leaf, and then you get this like added value. Is sort of the bait and switch that we're trying to.
Here because I work with a lot of the scholars that are interested in using Leaf, and you mentioned, you know, human bandwidth. I think in a way, you're underestimating the patience and the meticulousness of the humanities scholars that have been adding their notes and organizing them by color, and you know, so it's just kind of like a question of remediating that process and making it easier for them to visualize this as just the remediation of their research process.
At the same time, I do think that the question of human bandwidth and infrastructure are deeply interlinked in that a lot of these projects nowadays are not about individual scholars and their outputs, but about collaborative workflows that humanists generally are very poorly trained for in graduate school, if at all. And part of what the infrastructure can achieve is provide greater systematicity for how that is to unfold. So one of the things that Kirsta has been insisting on, and thank you again for that, is that we've been keeping a data dictionary from day one. And so every decision we make about how we structure the data and why we're approaching it a certain way is documented, so that the next graduate student who joins the project has at least general reference point for how we do things. Because the bandwidth shrinks exponentially once it's more than one brain that has to hold it all together, right?
Are there other comments or questions from the group? If not, then perhaps we can go have a cookie and a cup of coffee. I thank my colleagues again for presenting today on this topic. Thank you so much. It's fascinating.